Hello and what's up, my friends? It's Thunderbob here, and tonight we're going to be talking about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I know I'm super late to the party on this, but I picked it up ages ago and kind of set it aside. It's a very long game, and I needed to wait until I had some free time to dig into this. For some background, I'm an old fart of a gamer. I don't play a lot of JRPGs these days just because they are so time-consuming, but growing up, it was one of my favorite genres. Chrono Trigger, Earthbound, Final Fantasy VI are still some of my favorite games of all time. I played the original Final Fantasy VII on PC 25 years ago or so, and I really enjoyed it. In fact, here is my PC copy at the top of my video game shrine. And if you look inside here, this is actually how they want you to play this game on a keyboard. This is how I played through this game back in the day. I didn't use a controller. I used this little insert over my keyboard. And I regardless of that, I really enjoyed it. It felt new and fresh, and it brought a level of storytelling and cinematic flourish to the JRPG formula that was just missing at the time. And after 7, I really didn't play a lot of Final Fantasy. You know, I booted up a couple of them, but I don't think I've beaten any of the games after 7. That's kind of sad to say, but JRPGs just aren't really my jam these days, but with the Remake and Rebirth, it really made me re-explore the genre, and I picked up Remake when it was released on PC a few years ago, and I thought it was okay. I didn't love it, I didn't hate it, it was kind of in between. And now I've completed Rebirth on the PlayStation 5, and I have similar feelings. I don't think it's a bad game, but rather an average game. But it's a bad remake. Somewhere in the package is a really good game held back by a lot of bad design choices and unnecessary padding that really gutted my childhood friend. So, why did the remakes fail for me? First, let's compare them to the original game. The section of the original game that inspired the first remake is about 6 hours long, and was basically an introduction to the game taking place exclusively in the city of Midgard, and it was dragged out to more than 30 hours. The section of the original game that inspired Rebirth was maybe 20 hours long, and is dragged out somewhere between 50 and 120 hours, depending on your patience with open world filler content. Most of the added stuff just doesn't work for me, and overall makes for a poorly paced experience. The open world is beautiful, but full of repetitive objectives with little to no story relevance, framed around a character new to the series, named Chadley, who is perhaps the weakest addition to the remake series. The side missions and mini-games are fun at times, but the frequency of them really throws off the pacing of the game. I also really don't love the combat. It feels like it's trying to appease two groups of people, those who want traditional turn-based combat, and those that want real-time, fast-paced combat, but for me it fails in both regards. I did largely enjoy the main story and quest, though most of the changes and additions, they work, they're not terribly offensive, but I can't help but feel like it would have been better if this was just a straightforward remake of the original. So let's dig deeper into each of these topics, and try to explain my thoughts before I get too many pitchforks thrown at me. Also, fair warning, there will be some spoilers, as I think that is necessary to compare some of the key moments in the original game to show why I think the remake has failed so much. So let's start with what actually works here. The presentation is quite good. You know, the graphics, the audio, the voice acting, just the whole package, it looks really beautiful. It's a good looking and sounding game. I think overall, the graphics are pretty top-notch. I played this on the PlayStation 5, and as long as you stay on the graphical preset, everything looks clean and sharp. The performance mode is another matter, and it's quite blurry, and this is one of the few games I actually avoid the performance and I stick to the graphical setting, as I think that the graphical fidelity that's lost in the performance mode just isn't worth it, and the graphical mode maintains a pretty consistent 30 FPS. The game's not going to win any graphical awards, but the large open world areas and the small scale locations and buildings you explore are all well realized and have a nice lived-in feeling. The crumbling infrastructure and buildings make it feel like the world is old and on the brink of collapse. And occasionally there are some lower resolution textures like some rocks or vending machine or something, but outside of these instances, I think everything looks quite good. The character models in particular are all great, especially for the main cast, side characters, and even random town NPCs mostly look good. The audio and the soundtrack are very well done. All the voice acting is superb and really adds to the experience, and the soundtrack is memorable, especially the parts taken or inspired by the original game. So overall, the presentation is just really, really top-notch, really high quality. If you're looking for a game that looks and sounds like a AAA experience, like you can't go wrong. This is just a really beautiful looking game, sounding game. The whole package, the presentation, everything is very, very well done. But let's move on from that. Let's talk about the main kind of story and the story's pacing. And I think this is where things start to fall apart for me. I think overall, the main story is fine, but as someone who really enjoyed the original game, the changes and additions are mostly a fail. There are a few things added here that I just think don't work. Like how this is framed as more of a multiversal sequel, playing out maybe differently to the original rather than a remake. But the alternate reality stuff with Zack feels just like a waste of time as well. And maybe it will come more into play in the final game, but I'm not so sure. And many of the locations and events from the original have been retained, but a lot of them have substantially been changed to the point where it feels like a different game altogether. You know, there were a lot of silly moments in the original, but there was also a lot of serious moments. And here it feels like a lot of those elements that were very serious in the original have just been kind of neglected. It's missing some of those darker tones and elements at times in favor of having like more silly mini games and more funny moments. And, you know, there are some parts that I like. Some things that have been updated or changed that I do enjoy. Like, I think the date scene and the various ways it can play out is very fun. The intro to the Golden Saucer area is just bonkers. It's like a Bollywood song and dance scene. The banter and the camaraderie between the main characters is probably the best part of the story in the game. And it's fun just to go on this adventure with the crew, and one of the main reasons that I continued playing. But getting back to the parts that failed, you know, there are a couple of kind of like key moments in the original game, and this is one of the spots we're going to get into some major spoilers. So if you don't want to be spoiled on some critical moments of the original and the remake, you should stop now. So the original game, there are a few key moments that I feel really made the game memorable. And this is an area I think the remake kind of bungled. Some of these moments were just not translated well. You know, iconic moments like Aerith's death scene are just treated terribly. It was so simple and straightforward in the original. You know, Sephiroth stabs her, and then Cloud mourns her and drops her in the water, and it's very emotional. And in Rebirth, it's made much more ambiguous and complicated because of all the multiverse stuff going on. And, you know, there's hints that maybe you can change the timeline and you can save her. And it's edited in a really confusing way. Like, there are these ghostly whispers flying around, implying that maybe things can be changed. And, you know, it's just dragged out, and everything is a QTE event. For God's sake, they add a QTE event that's unwinnable. But in, like, my mind, I was thinking, like, if I can do this, maybe this is how I save Aerith, because it's, like, right before that moment. They added a QTE event in the Aerith death scene. It feels so disrespectful to the original game. And then instead of getting any time to process what has happened or show Cloud mourning or do like the drop her in the water thing, immediately there's like a 2-hour long 10-phase boss fight that crosses multiple realities and ends with a version of Aerith appearing and helping you defeat Sephiroth. Then this ghostly version of Aerith shows up with the party in the ending cutscene, but it seems like only Cloud can see her. So I'm not completely clear, even having beaten the game, even having watched some YouTube videos try to decipher this confusing mess of an ending. I'm still not completely sure what actually happened in the end. And I think that's a negative. Like, I feel like Square kind of wanted to have their cake and eat it too. Like, they wanted to both, save Aerith, but also have her die. They want to appease those people that want to change the narrative, and they wanted to appease the people that wanted to keep it very close to the original. And I think that they kind of failed both parties. In the end, it's muddy and difficult to understand, and Square just wants it both ways. And I think I would respect the game more if either it just changed the ending and Aerith lived, or if they kept it the same and she died, or even if they decided they wanted to kill someone else in that moment. Pull like a Walking Dead, and we're going to kill another character so you're not expecting it, but it's still, a meaningful moment. But just keep it straightforward without all the multiverse shenanigans. Any of that would be preferable to the version that we got, and the ambiguity and just the unclearness of the whole ending sequence that, we're not going to see a follow-up on for years, potentially. And all the added multiverse stuff and added content really ruins the pacing, which is one of the other issues I have with the game and the story. This has one of the slowest openings of any recent game I can think of. There's these really long forced walking sections that take forever, and they pop up multiple times throughout the game. Just overly long, repetitive cinematics that don't add much. There are moments where the game will give you a ton of freedom to explore, and then there are linear sections of the game that go on just for hours and hours, and you have very little control over how you proceed. Like the Costa del Sol section is a good example. In the original, this was like a fun little stop that was maybe 2 or 3 screens and took 30 minutes of your time. And they've expanded this section to multiple hours, and it really just doesn't add anything meaningful to the narrative or the gameplay other than some mad mini games and an encounter with Hojo. Everything just feels dragged out. Like they took every little story element from the original and expanded on it, and they just try to justify 3 full-priced games. But in the end, it kills a lot of the pacing and the impact of the narrative. Like that Hobbit quote comes to mind, like they tried to spread too little jam over too much toast. Overall, I just wish the game and the story was closer to the original game. And I would have preferred if they just used these incredible assets to tell that original story instead. And those pacing issues bleed over into almost every area of the game. Like the open world, I get so much open world fatigue, not just from this game, but from a lot of games. But Final Fantasy VII Remake is, has some of the worst open world content I have seen in a long time. And, Final Fantasy VII Remake, the first part, had almost no open world elements. And Rebirth has just too much. There's about 6 activity types that are repeated just over and over across these 7 large open world zones. And these activities are some of the most cut and paste Ubisoft style, climb the tower, kill this enemy objectives. Honestly, they're even less well designed than the Far Cry 3 climb the tower activities. I mean, at least those require a little bit of thinking and some skill to climb to the top. These are just the most boring. Climb a couple of ladders, hit a switch, do that 5 times per zone, do that 7 more times. And some of these activities, they're fun the first time, but they just get repeated over and over and over. It becomes so repetitive. In the first area, I tried to clear everything. Like, I think I got almost 100% in that first grassland zone, and it was kind of fun, if not a little bit repetitive, but not that bad. And then the second area opens up, and I realize it's just as large as the first, and the objectives are identical. Like, there's no change at all. Like, it's walk up, press the same buttons, do the same thing over and over again. And I ended up giving up on them completely about the halfway point. You know, up to that, I was not doing 100%, but like I was kind of trying to clear everything I found. And about halfway through the game, I just said, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to quit the game if I try to do any more open world stuff. And a lot of these areas are just tedious to explore as well. The map isn't very clear, and oftentimes how to reach an area requires a lot of backtracking, especially the more vertical zones. It's annoying to explore some of these areas. And beyond that, the open world stuff just feels so disconnected from the main story, as it very rarely overlaps with the bigger narrative. It really feels like two teams worked on this game, one creating an MMO-like open world with little story, and a team working on the actual main story elements, and that like they never communicated. Other than the cut and paste objectives, there's really nothing meaningful in the open world. There's almost no NPCs or story elements, only a handful of side quests that utilize these huge areas. It's huge and beautiful, but vapid and shallow. That's perhaps a good metaphor for the game overall. And there's just little to no story hook for any of these activities. You know, you have the Chadley stuff. He's asking you to get intel from each region, and you're basically just checking these things off from a checklist, filling a meter that has constant interruptions from Chadley. He's just constantly calling you after every activity. He probably has more voice lines in the game than any other character, maybe every other character combined. And you could largely ignore these open world objectives, you could just completely ignore them and you can beat the game, but you will be locked out from some of the best materia in the game. And overall, I would say this game would just be better if the Chadley stuff, if the open world stuff was just completely removed. They add nothing to the story and simply pad out the runtime. I would have preferred if each region just had a handful of interesting side missions and story missions that better utilized the open world elements. You know, you could even use some of the same activities, but recontextualizing them with more story elements would have made them much more acceptable. And speaking of the side missions, you know, there's a couple of them in each zone, maybe a half dozen or so. And I think most of them are kind of bad too. You know, a couple of them do add some meaningful story stuff, like most of the ones that are introduced by your main cast, your main party members, have some meaningful stuff in them. But for each of one of those, there are 2 or 3 that are like, go round up these chickens, please, and have very little to add to the world. A lot of them use like kind of bad mechanics, like the chocobo sniffing mechanic, where you gotta like find the hidden objects in the world. I think each zone has like 1 or 2 of those, it feels like. Only a handful of the side missions, you know, are very meaningful. Otherwise, it just feels like they're there to pad out the runtime. Yeah, I didn't really love the side content. And beyond that, much like the first remake, there are a ton of mini games here. I think it's a mixed bag. There's a couple of them I enjoy, but the majority of them are kind of just excruciating. I ended up enjoying Queen's Blood. I did almost every match in the game. I enjoyed the Fort Condor strategy game stuff. Most of the others, I would do them one time. I would try for a high score, and then I would never boot it up again. I don't mind, you know, some mini games like where you enter a city and there's a bunch of optional mini games on the mini map. That's actually kind of fun and exciting to go and explore. What I didn't like is you'd get into a zone, and it's like you have to go and do all of these mini games before you can progress. You know, they do that a couple times throughout the game, and it really breaks the pacing of everything. Really stops the momentum. This was especially egregious between like Upper Junon and Costa del Sol region. It feels like there are like 8 hours of required mini games, running around town looking for the soldiers, and then doing the marching mini game, the Queen's Blood tournament, the mini games to get the swimsuits for all your characters, I think individually the minigames are, kind of a fun diversion, but some of these sections are just overloaded with them and completely break the pacing and the urgency of the story and the narrative. There's also a few kind of dungeon areas that rely on specific puzzle mechanics that they're just not good. They last way longer than necessary and use some of the jankiest mechanics. Like Chapter 11 in particular comes to mind. The box puzzles that Kate Sith has, where he picks up these boxes and he throws them at switches, and they do it like 20 times. And some of them you have to throw these boxes on moving platforms, and it's just some of the most painful, boring, repetitive stuff ever. The game would be better without these sections, and there's a couple others that use like a swinging mechanic, or like there's probably like 3 or 4 dungeons in the game that they introduce one puzzle mechanic that's used just throughout that dungeon, and then it's never seen again, and it really, again, it kills the pacing. They're just not very fun mechanically. Like the engine just is not made for that kind of gameplay. Yeah, so just flagrant padding to add to the runtime. There's other sections of the game where you play the same events multiple times from different perspectives without any real meaningful change to the gameplay, and it's pretty clear Square wants gamers to feel that they got their money out of the trilogy, and that each part has a runtime to match, a full Final Fantasy game. But it leads to just a lot of unsatisfying, repetitive gameplay. And at the same time, there are several areas that were cut from the original, Rocket Town. There's entire characters that should be playable here, like Sid or Vincent, but they just tag along with you. Like, they're introduced, but they're not playable characters. And it feels like instead of all this added stuff, actually do everything from the original game, and maybe you wouldn't have to pad so much. And then, like, the last aspect I have some issues with, the combat. And I know there are people out there that just love the combat. It just doesn't work for me. It feels like it's trying to split the difference between the old school turn-based combat and the more fast-paced modern action game. But it doesn't work for me. It's like, it doesn't do either of those things as good as other games in those respective genres. Your partners are largely just idiots. Even when you use materia to force them to take certain actions, you lose a ton of power if you're not just constantly switching between characters. The normal attack feels like fine for an action game, but it does almost no damage. And the pause it takes to use an action or a spell for any of your characters, it breaks the flow of the combat. And I know you can set up shortcuts for these moves, but waiting for the bar to fill and the long wind-up and the animation, it just makes it feel like a bad action game. And the combat just does not feel fluid or smooth. I would have preferred if either they went completely turn-based with some active elements, like something like Expedition 33, which was a really good RPG with really good turn-based combat, or if they committed just completely to the action side. Just say, screw all the turn-based fans. We're going to make a God of War or a Devil May Cry style game. Either one of those directions I would have been okay with, but it's this kind of middle ground that feels worse than either of those genres individually. And most fights, I just normal attacked until I could assess the enemy. I'd learn what their weakness was, and then I would throw that weakness until they're staggered or pressured, and just throw all of my limit breaks at the same time, and the fight was over. I didn't think that any of the fights were terribly difficult. I don't think I actually died once during the game. And they're not hard, they're just time-consuming. Like, some of these fights, like the very last fight of the game is like a 90-minute, just, it never ends. And they're not hard, they're just long. Like, I'm not exaggerating, I have fallen asleep in the middle of combat because I was finding it so boring. So, I don't love the combat. And I know some people really enjoy this, like, quasi-turn-based real-time. For me, I would have preferred if they went either direction and just committed to it. They also completely changed things from the remake to the rebirth, like the upgrade systems. They went from each of your weapons having its own tree, to now you have these folio and books that you put skill points into. And you can only do this from bookshops or from certain machines near the save benches. Neither system feels very fleshed out or makes a huge amount of difference. Like, most of them are just like, here 3% more physical damage, 5% more active energy, regeneration. Like, very small upgrades. But it just makes the whole package feel less cohesive from the remake to Rebirth. My hope was that someday that they would release a package that combined all 3 games and would upgrade all the assets to be like the 3rd game in the series. So you'd have like a complete package. But like, since each of these games seems to be like completely different mechanically, in my mind, it's going to be really hard for them to ever try to make like one complete package, which feels like kind of a miss. Yeah, so overall, the combat, the systems, none of it really jives with me. Maybe it works better for you out there, but sorry, I really didn't love the combat. And that's kind of, those are the aspects that didn't work for me. Yeah, I don't hate the remake or Rebirth. I just am kind of disappointed. Final Fantasy VII was a seminal gaming moment for me, and it really changed how I saw games. It showed little 12-year-old Bob that a game could be just as cinematic as a movie and have deep story that made me care about the characters, and I really would have preferred a more straightforward remake of that game, without the changes to the story, without the addition of all the multiverse crap, without the open world repetitive padding, with either a more traditional combat style or just pivot all the way into the action style. I would still probably play the 3rd game just to see how this finishes, but overall, I think these are just middling remakes so far, and if this formula was used in a new Final Fantasy, I would probably not finish it. Honestly, the only reason I continued through this is because I enjoyed these characters, and I had that nostalgia for them from the old games. So that's where I'm at. I didn't hate it. If I was going to score this, it would probably be like a 7, but it's the pedigree. It's that this is the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and we're probably never going to get another one of these. I'm never going to get the true to the original remake that kind of has me so disappointed. So that's where I'm at. If you agree or disagree, leave me a comment below. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. If you enjoyed this, like, subscribe, all that jazz. Just want to thank you for watching, and have a good night, everybody.